Hey, what's up guys? In this session, I want to talk about wide angle lens compositions. Wide angle lenses are a huge part of outdoor photography, especially in like the landscape photography and travel photography section, because of what it can do to your images when you connect that onto your camera. And the main idea here is distortion and elongation. But before we get to that, like I have this amazing scene set up behind me. It's fall here, the leaves are hitting the ground, it's super cold right now, but we still have some snow on the ground that's barely covering the leaves that are on the ground here. And I also have my camera behind me set up with a wide angle lens, photographing this little walking bridge going back into the forest with fall color. Just a beautiful scene and a really good opportunity to use the wide angle lens. But before we get into this scenario and how I have this shot set up, I do want to talk about your wide angle lens compositions and what a wide angle lens is going to do for your compositions. Because when you think about a wide angle lens, you have to think about the right scenarios and situations to use that. So you want to set yourself up for success when you're using each type of lens for what it's going to do for your overall composition in outdoor photography. So the first thing that you really need to think about, and the most prominent thing you need to think about with a wide angle lens, is the distortion and elongation aspect that it creates via the way the lens and the glass is set up inside of the barrel of the lens. So what happens here is it separates distances or elongates those distances between one another. So if you have subjects that are fairly close together, the wide angle lens actually makes them appear looking very far apart and very far from one another. It also is going to make things in the background appear very, very small. So if you have like a big foreground feature, that's going to be the most prominent thing in your photography. But if you have like big mountains in the background that are in your composition and you're using a wide angle lens, those are going to appear extremely small, little bitty mountains, and are really going to take away from the grand aspect. So to really wrap your mind around this, let's show this example of Oxbow Bend in Grand Teton National Park that I shot. The first image that you're seeing is shot with a wide angle lens. Now, if you'll see in the composition, in the foreground, there's tons of water, like almost the entire bottom of the frame is filled up with water. That's because with a wide angle lens, what's happening here is it's using that distortion to fill that foreground. And that's what I was doing with this image. But in the background, you see the mountains aren't really all that big. They're kind of small in the background and they're kind of hidden by the sunrise as well, but they're very small in comparison of what you think when you think of a big mountain landscape. Let's look at the flip side of this. I shot a very similar sunrise in Grand Teton National Park using a telephoto lens at the exact same distance from the mountains, and the telephoto lens compressed the distances and made the mountains in the background look much, much larger than our wide angle lens example. So looking at these two side by side, you can see the differences here. Now, it's not saying that one is better than the other, or you should use one over the other in this situation. That goes into your creative vision as an outdoor photographer. However, when you think about your lens selection and your composition and how that affects different things within your frame, you need to think about, within my creative vision here, what lens do I need to select? So the wide angle lens is great for smaller landscapes that don't really have a grand aspect to them. For example, waterfalls are great for wide angle lens photography because that foreground feature is going to be larger and that distortion is going to make it look like it's coming directly at the camera, almost like out of the frame at somebody. So those small scenes like that are going to be great for a wide angle lens. Another way that I like to use wide angle lenses is for like the shot that I have here behind me with pathways. And this is getting into some of our composition foundations of leading lines with a wide angle lens and using what we know about wide angle lenses and how they distort the frame to our advantage because it's going to allow us to frame this up using leading lines, taking you back into the frame and really leading you through that frame to the main subject, which in this case is kind of like the bridge and fall color. So let's take a look at this composition and see how pathways can really be used well and how we can learn about wide angle lens compositions from these ideas. Okay, so as I frame up this composition that's in front of me, let's think about the compositional foundations here based on what we learned a couple sessions ago. So as I show you into my camera, what you can see is the main idea here, how I have this framed up, featuring the fall leaves in the background of this bridge landscape outdoor shot, really featuring those fall leaves, having them predominantly featured within the frame. You'll notice the horizon line is a little bit closer to the top of the frame. That's because there's some negative space up there, some highlights that I didn't want within the frame. So pushing your wide angle lens down a little bit and getting that level out, it's not really important to the photograph. So getting that out of the frame was pretty key here, and removing distractions and eliminating those things from the composition in itself. So moving along, like what are we using here as the subject line? Well, that's the bridge itself, going back, taking you back towards the trees and the fall leaves themselves. And using that, what we're actually doing here is using leading lines. So when you use these leading lines with a wide angle lens, you can see that they pull from the edges. You can see how wide these are on the very edges of your frame. That's what a wide angle lens does. It pulls those edges. So anything that's closer to the right side of the frame or the left side of the frame is really going to reveal some distortion and pulling on those features, making them more pronounced and larger for you as the photographer to use those as your advantage. It's not a disadvantage. It's not something that the lens is doing wrong. It's an opportunity for you as the photographer to use that knowledge in your composition basics to know, okay, well, I'm using a wide angle lens here. It's gonna pull towards those edges. I can use this bridge and these wood planks on this bridge to direct my viewer's eye towards the fall color and the forest that's in the background. So setting all of these things up is really good. Notice also, you may be thinking, okay, the subject's in the middle of the frame here. Well, not technically. See, we have the boards and the sides of this bridge on predominantly the rule of thirds grid. So where they end up and where they finish is almost making a square in the middle of that frame, hitting all the edges of that rule of thirds grid. Just really sound composition and use of the grid lines and use of leading lines going directly back into the frame, showing you a good composition and how you can use the distortion of a wide angle lens to feature something prominently and using those things to your advantage. It's always really funny to me in what different situations I'll find myself when I'm shooting with a wide angle lens, because you can really get into some really weird compositional situations here, and I'm like back into this tree and I have leaves all the way around me. I think that's an interesting way to use a wide angle lens against to your advantage, and that distortion here to your advantage, because you're able to shoot through these tree limbs and through this fall color, really adding like a complementary detail within the fall season if you're shooting within that, and kind of telling a story with your composition, and then having that bridge in the background. So again, I'll take you into the camera and kind of show you a compositional trick that we haven't really gotten to yet, and what we'll be exploring more in a future session. But what we have here is a natural window, a space, a compositional space that we're able to photograph this bridge through and have that main subject of the bridge featured really well in this scene. So as we look for different ways to use our wide angle lens and have like these leaves over top of us and kind of framing these tree limbs, that's one is on the top of the frame, one's on the bottom of the frame, creating that balance in our photograph composition with a wide angle lens, but having them so close to the camera but still showing up and kind of blurred out as like this secondary object is a great way to use a wide angle lens. The wider the lens, the more you can fit in onto the side, but also the wider the lens, the more distortion and warping that you get on the side. So always be aware of that too whenever you are framing something up with a wide angle lens. So we've looked at subject placement, we've looked at leading lines, we've looked at and introduced the concept of shooting through natural windows. But one of my favorite ways to use a wide angle lens to its advantage in an outdoor photography composition is using a vertical composition. And why I love this is because when you tilt your camera vertically with a wide angle lens, you can tilt it down a little bit and have it predominantly feature a foreground. Remember what we said about the bridge. The more you put those bridge banisters and those railings to the edges of your frame, the more they're gonna pull and distort and pull that viewer into the scene. So I like to use that main idea of wide angle lens distortion and using that pulling aspect to use with a vertical shot and have my camera pointed down. So with this composition that I'm working with, we have a fern here that we're using for our foreground, and there's another little fern right behind it, kind of having a repetition pattern and almost like a bouncing leading line, having you taken back into the frame. And then in the background, we have the bridge. So what we have here is a use of almost like an anchor point in our composition, because when you tilt your wide angle lens down enough, what happens is that anchor point becomes placed on the bottom third's grid line, and we have it predominantly featured. And it's like this big, just anchor to the bottom of it, holding our composition in place. And then we have our complementary subjects like the second fern and the bridge in the background working as our main subject. So remember this though, when you're working with a composition and having something framed up vertically, you never want that big foreground feature to take away from the main subject. You want it to tell a story and complement that. So always remember that. I love doing this with waterfall photography, having a little cascade kind of taking you directly into the frame and having that predominantly featured. Another foliage aspect that we have here in Great Sand Dunes National Park, having a big rubber rabbit brush bush in full bloom, yellow with the background and the mountain scene behind it, was a really good foreground to use. So always remember, don't just shoot in a horizontal view. Vertically, a wide angle lens really shines because it uses that distortion aspect and that feature. And you now knowing how that works, you can place your foreground elements really strategically within your frame and your composition in the outdoors to have that pronounced most. So as you can see, there are tons of advantages that you have as an outdoor photographer when you're using a wide angle lens. You can work your way all around the scene and really shoot things dead on like we did with this bridge, and having it in a landscape view or a horizontal view using these banisters as a way of bringing you into the frame and using our leading lines directly towards that. And we also moved a little bit further off and worked with natural windows, using the distortion and how close you can get to objects with a wide angle lens to our advantage. And then lastly, we used the fern as an anchor point in a composition, tilting our wide angle lens down, using it that way. So never take one shot with a wide angle lens and then move on. Always work your way all the way around the scene, because these 3 shots here that we got today are a great example of what you can do with a wide angle lens and outdoor photography, and how you can frame up your compositions really, really well in an outdoor scene with a wide angle lens. In this session, I really wanted to talk about composition with wildlife photography because we love shooting wildlife outdoors too. Compositions aren't just meant for those epic landscape photos that we know and love so much with great light and leading lines and all that. I want to talk about wildlife photography and how you can be set up to take the best wildlife photos outdoors. Now, I'm out right now in a location near where I live where bald eagles nest and come in the late fall, early winter. So I'm out here searching for those bald eagle shots and getting really close to them, as close as possible, and just framing up the best eagle shots there are. Now, the first thing that you need to know about wildlife photography and composition is that it's not like going out in landscape photography and framing everything up. Your subjects in wildlife are moving targets. They move around, they search through the frame, and it's your job as a photographer to adjust to them and move your composition as the wildlife moves throughout the shot. So you constantly have to reframe, rearrange. It's not like the composition for wildlife is difficult. It's the movement of your subject that makes it difficult. So what I use to frame up my wildlife photography as much as possible is the rule of thirds. And it's one of our most basic fundamentals of composition and outdoor photography. But I use the rule of thirds more often in wildlife photography than in any other genre of photography because it's basically like a mix of outdoor photography and portrait photography. Your subject is just an animal. So always framing up your subjects to be placed on one of the rule of thirds grid line or have the main idea of that subject placed on a grid line. For example, their head, their face, their eyes on one of those intersecting points of the rule of third is really, really important. And that involves you of filling the entire frame. The filling the frame aspect of wildlife photography is really important because when you frame that up on a rule of thirds line, or when you have that just epic portrait shot of a wildlife creature, you want it to fill the entire frame. You don't want your audience and your viewers searching through the frame and trying to figure out, where's the wildlife here? Where's the subject? I'm having a hard time finding it. You want that predominantly placed and filling the entire frame. Now, another thing to keep in mind for sure is going with the flow of your subject matter. For example, look at these two shots of flamingos that I have here. One causes tension. One causes freedom to move about and explore more of the framing. So when you're framing these up, you always want to go with the direction of the flow of where that is moving. So if the head and face are pointed towards one direction, I'm going to leave more space in front of that face and in front of that gaze of the eyes in that side of the frame, because I want the viewer to explore more of the image. And if that's on the opposite side, you get stuck. There's tension, there's not a great composition going on here and not a good flow of the image going on here. It almost looks like you were too late to the scene and you took the photograph too late. So always go with the flow of having these set up within your composition. Another thing you should really focus on is not only the eyes having the focal point of your wildlife photography directly on the eye of the wildlife, but also having the eyes framed up properly. I just talked about the main idea of the wildlife shot, going out and finding that wildlife and then framing it up properly. You want those eyes as the main focal point on one of those intersecting lines of the rule of third grid. Even if you're filling the entire frame and you don't have a lot of area outside of the head of the animal, put those eyes directly on those two intersecting points of the rule of thirds grid, and it's going to be a much more aesthetically pleasing shot, or a much more helpful photograph to look at, and people are going to enjoy that photograph more. So always watch for where you're placing the eyes. Don't have it way down at the bottom or cutting off part of the head of the animal. You want those eyes really predominantly featured because that's what you're focusing to when you're photographing wildlife. Another thing, guys, is really be aware and notice what the wildlife is doing within its habitat, within the outdoors, because you want to avoid the butt shot here. You want the main focus being on the animal itself. You don't want a photograph of the rear part of the animal. You know, again, that says, I got there too late, I missed the shot, this is the best I could get. Always work around your subject, being safe too, but working around that subject and finding vantage points and perspective where you can get predominantly the front or the side of the animal and not compose the image to have the rear end of the animal within the shot too much. Once you do all these things and really start to get a good grip on composition for wildlife photography, start incorporating that animal and that wildlife into the surrounding landscapes. These are like those money wildlife shots where you have a landscape photo and a wildlife photo kind of combined. I've had a lot of success doing this with elk photography during the rut season and their mating season, having just the elk predominantly featured, but also having a lot of the landscape fall color around it featured as well. Always work around, find things within its habitat to say, hey, this is a cheetah and it's walking around the bush country and it's out in the wilderness. You know, photograph it within those elements to take your wildlife photography and take that composition to another level, because when you know how to frame it up, you'll also know how to incorporate it into a scene, doing that composition, knowing our basics and having the composition just nailed down and dialed in.